Air raid sirens wailing in the night like a banshee's harbinger of death. Pitch dark skies without a glimmer of light escaping through thickly woven blackout curtains. Searchlights slicing the sky and the distant rumble of anti-aircraft guns. These were just some of the sights and sounds of World War II on Britain's home front. But the onset of war didn't mean that the country's other troubles ended. Amongst the chaos of the global conflict, criminals continued to operate, selling black market goods, looting bombed out buildings, and sometimes committing murder. It was Friday, 17th of July 1942, and labourer Ben Marshall was looking forward to finishing work for the day. His job cleaning up debris in the bombed-out Vauxhall Baptist Chapel in South London was gruelling, and he had struggled to gain entry to the chapel's cellar, but had eventually managed to access it via the warehouse next door. World War II had been raging for almost 3 years by now, and Ben paused for a moment to catch his breath as he surveyed the rubble, remembering the day that conflict had broken out on 1st of September 1939. Those fateful words, uttered by Neville Chamberlain on the radio 2 days later, marked the point of no return and were permanently burnt into the minds of everyone who heard them. On one of those rare days in history when everyone, young and old, would forever remember what they were doing at the moment when life changed forever.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
At first, not much had happened on the home front during the eerily quiet period which became known as the Phony War. Blackout regulations had been in place long before any bombs were dropped, meaning that all windows and doors were covered at night to prevent any escaping sliver of light which could guide enemy planes to their targets. Street lamps were dimmed or switched off entirely, while vehicle headlights were fitted with shrouds. Anyone breaking blackout regulations received a steep fine, and the number of accidents rose dramatically as the population navigated the unnerving darkness. Rationing of clothes, food and petrol proved a continual frustration, with women queuing for hours every day, clutching their ration coupons to buy their share of scarce produce to feed their families. Husbands, fathers, sons and brothers were sent to fight on the front lines, while wives, mothers, daughters and sisters joined the women's branches of the services, worked in factories, on farms, as air raid precautions wardens, and even as code breakers. The Blitz added to people's woes between September 1940 and May 1941, a sustained bombing campaign in which over 50,000 high-explosive bombs and many more small but ruinous incendiaries battered England's capital, dropped by hundreds of German planes for more than 50 consecutive nights. The industry and docks of the East End suffered badly, but nowhere was safe. Even Buckingham Palace and historic landmarks were hit, while St Paul's Cathedral was set ablaze but famously survived, its spire rising high as a symbol of defiance amid clouds of smoke and dust. Other cities also suffered bombing raids, but London was one of the most dangerous places to be. 40,000 British people were killed during the Blitz, around half of whom were Londoners, and 1.4 million people in the city were made homeless. Terrified people huddled in air raid shelters, mourning the loss of homes and families, but there was a feeling of camaraderie and Blitz spirit, a determination never to give in. Phyllis Warner, a teacher living in Bloomsbury who kept a journal during this period, wrote,
"One of the oddest things about our everyday life is its mixture of ruthless horror and everyday routine. I pick my way to work past the bomb craters and the shattered glass and sit at my desk in a room with a large hole in the roof. Next to a house reduced to matchwood, housewives are giving prosaic orders to the baker and the milkman. Nobody seems to mind the day raids, which do little damage. It is the nights, which are like a continuous nightmare, from which there is no merciful awakening. Yet people won't move away. I know that I'm a fool to go on sleeping in central London, which gets plastered every night, but I feel that if others can stand it, so can I."
Now, in July 1942, the Blitz had been over for more than a year, and although bombs still fell, the frequency had reduced, and Londoners were already attempting to rebuild the flattened parts of the capital. Ben Marshall was one of those engaged in this gargantuan task, and as he shovelled dirt and rubble in the airless cellar, he spotted a paving slab leaning against the wall. He pushed it aside, the edges grinding noisily against the stone flooring, then stepped back in dismay. Partially hidden behind the slab were the decomposing remains of a human being.
"There's a body down there."
Marshall called out to his foreman, who came to inspect the grisly find. It was common to find bodies or severed limbs in the wreckage of buildings, but this one was unusual, as the labourers couldn't help noticing that it didn't look like the other bomb victims they had seen. The naked corpse had been dismembered, with the arms cut off at the elbow and the legs cut off at the knee. The head was separated from the rest of the body, and the flesh had been entirely burnt away. A few hairs remained on the skull. The body was examined by Home Office pathologist Dr. Keith Simpson at Southwark Mortuary, who established that it was a female aged between 40 and 50, about 5 foot 1 inches in height, with brown hair turning grey. A small area of bleeding and damage around the thyroid cartilage had occurred while the woman was still alive, indicating that she had been strangled. Agreeing with the labourers' initial misgivings, Dr. Simpson was convinced that this was not a bombing victim. It was a case of murder. Traces of lime were also found on the remains, suggesting that someone had tried to expedite decomposition. DNA profiling was not yet possible, and fingerprints couldn't be taken as the skin had been destroyed by fire. So the only way for police to identify the victim was to trawl through the missing persons files for all women of a similar age who had been reported missing around the time that death had taken place. Dr. Simpson felt she'd been deceased for around 12 to 18 months. narrowing it down to the spring of 1941. There were hundreds of names in the missing persons register, so Divisional Detective Inspector Frederick Hatton and Detective Inspector Joseph Keeling of the Metropolitan Police decided to focus on women living in the vicinity of the chapel. It was no easy feat, as police numbers had been cut by 28%, with young and active officers deployed to fight in the war, and although most people came together to do their bit to help the Allies to victory, there were some who took advantage of the chaos to operate under the radar, with crime rising by 57% since the beginning of the war. Despite these challenging conditions, detectives were undeterred and eventually came up with a name. Rachel Dobkin, née Dubinsky, seemed to fit the facts. Rachel Dubinsky was born in August 1892 in Mile End to Father Barnett, a hat manufacturer, and Mother Sarah. Barnett and Sarah had fled persecution in Russia after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, an event which led to the scapegoating of Jews. They arrived in Whitechapel before moving to nearby Bethnal Green and then Shoreditch, and had 4 children, Rachel the eldest, followed by Nathaniel, Mary and Polly. Later, Nathaniel became a ladies' hat maker like his father, while Polly worked as a shorthand typist and then as a bookkeeper. Rachel too joined her father in the hat making business. On Friday 11th of April 1941, 49-year-old Rachel failed to arrive at her mother's house for dinner. This was highly unusual, as it was a family routine to eat together every night. Concerned, her sister Polly went to Rachel's flat the next morning and let herself in with a spare key, finding the bed sheets undisturbed, suggesting she hadn't slept there the night before. Polly reported her missing and provided a photo of her sister, but was disappointed by the police's lack of effort to find Rachel. She visited them several times, explaining that Rachel struggled with her mental health and had spent time in a hospital under observation. Polly placed a notice in the newspaper asking for information about her sister's whereabouts, and even visited a medium, Madame Nerva, handing the clairvoyant a scarf and jumper belonging to Rachel. As Madame Nerva slipped into a trance, she clutched her throat in terror, making terrifying choking noises, but was unable to speak. Desperate for answers, Polly visited another spiritualist who claimed to see Rachel in a hot room and said ominously, "There is passing out. A sudden death." Eventually, the police had made inquiries and discovered Rachel's handbag at a post office in Guildford, Surrey. Inside were rail tickets dated the day after her disappearance, and detectives speculated that she had run away to start a new life or had committed suicide. There, the trail had gone cold. When Detective Inspectors Hatton and Keeling read the notes from the police file, they began to have doubts that the body really was Rachel Dobkin, particularly as her bag had been found more than 30 miles away soon after her disappearance. But pathologist Dr. Simpson became obsessed with proving the identity of the burnt and dismembered woman, so he contacted Mary Newman, a forensic photographer at Guy's Hospital, sending her x-rays of the skull and a photograph of missing Rachel Dobkin. When Newman superimposed Rachel's face onto the x-ray image, it was obvious that the two were a perfect match. Forensic photography was still in its infancy, although it had been used once before at the trial of murderous Dr. Buck Ruxton in 1936. But Simpson didn't want to take any chances that the identification wouldn't stand up to scrutiny. he contacted every dentist in a 5-mile radius of Rachel's home and finally found the practice she was registered with. They still had her dental records, and after comparing them to the teeth belonging to the corpse, Simpson conclusively proved that the body was that of Rachel Dobkin. One question had been answered, but several remained. Who had killed her, and why? And how did her handbag end up in Guildford containing rail tickets dated the day after she went missing? Detectives spoke to Rachel's sister Polly and learned more about the murdered woman's life, as well as the person who might have wanted her dead. When Rachel Dubinsky was 28, she met a dark-haired, well-built man named Harry Dobkin through a marriage broker, as it was common in the Jewish community at that time for parents to arrange spouses for their children. The pair married in the autumn of 1920 at Bethnal Green Synagogue and moved into a house at 302 Kennington Lane, the same road as the burnt-out chapel where Rachel's body was later discovered. The relationship was acrimonious and they fought constantly, separating after just a few weeks. Rachel had already fallen pregnant, and by the time their son Stanley was born in June 1921, Harry was working away at sea as a third-class steward on a Cunard ocean liner. He visited Rachel and his son when he was on leave, but each time he would hit his wife, leaving her with a black eye, then slope off to stay at his parents' house a few miles away. Harry was summoned to the Old Street Police Court for failing to provide for his family, and was ordered to pay Rachel £1 a week for the upkeep of their son, but spent 6 weeks in prison for falling behind with the payments. Divorce was not only an expensive option, but still carried a stigma at that time, so he chose to remain married, even though it meant finding money for the weekly payments, which he tried to dodge at every opportunity. After leaving prison, he took a job with the White Star Line and stayed at sea for 10 years. When he returned, he claimed that Rachel's parents offered him £8 to reconcile with his wife, and the unhappy couple lived together again for a short time. Harry accused Rachel of hiding his seaman's discharge papers, while she suspected that he had taken her brooch and reported him to the police. He was arrested on suspicion of theft, but the case was dismissed and he returned to live with his parents. In 1935, someone set a fire on Rachel's doorstep with an oily rag and paper, but no damage was done and the perpetrator was never found. 2 years later, Rachel was hospitalised after being beaten by Harry and developed anxiety and depression. By 1939, Rachel was unable to work due to injuries inflicted by her husband's constant assaults and was surviving solely on his unreliable maintenance payments. Harry was now working as a street trader, making and selling aprons, and their son Stanley, now 18, was earning a wage as a customs shipping clerk. On 8th of April 1941, 49-year-old Rachel visited medium Hilda Nerva, seeking guidance for her uncertain future as she was still out of work and felt heavy-hearted and hopeless. During the session, Madame Nerva's expression changed when she touched her client's wedding ring. Shadows cast by the flickering candle flame danced across her sorrowful face as she warned Rachel in a lugubrious tone, "You are about to meet someone new. Don't go. I see sadness in your future." 3 days later, Rachel disappeared and was never seen alive again, and in a strange coincidence, her sister would visit the same medium in hope of receiving a clue from beyond as to her whereabouts. Police located a witness who who had seen Rachel on Friday 11th of April 1941, a cafe owner who reported seeing Mr. and Mrs. Dobkin drinking tea together. When questioned, Harry Dobkin admitted to visiting the cafe with his wife, but insisted he went to work afterwards at his market stall. Several other witnesses confirmed seeing him at work that afternoon, but knowing how badly he treated Rachel, her sister Polly was convinced he was somehow involved. The investigation was initially based on the assumption that Rachel Dobkin had been among the 150,000 Londoners trying to make her way to an air raid shelter when the siren went off, and had been waylaid in the darkness by someone with murderous intentions. Detective Inspectors Hatton and Keeling decided to re-examine the chapel where the body was found, noticing that it had not only been bombed but gutted by fire, which they assumed was caused by the Luftwaffe's devastating incendiaries. They unearthed the records and learned that a fire had been burning for over an hour on Tuesday 15th of April 1941 before being reported at 3:30 a.m. However, the bomb damage had been caused earlier and there were no explosives dropped on the area that night, so something else must have started the fire, which experts believed originated in the cellar. The investigators were surprised that the fire had been allowed to burn for so long without being extinguished. Throughout World War II, fire watchers were stationed on the roofs of buildings or other high vantage points to help them quickly spot and report smoke and flames, smothering any fires in their assigned areas with sandbags, buckets of water or stirrup pumps. Hatton and Keeling knew fire watchers worked and lived in the vicinity of the chapel, so why hadn't they responded sooner on the night of the blaze? Records confirmed there had been a fire watcher on duty at the time, based in the warehouse next door to the chapel. He had started his role as a fire watcher just a week earlier, and his name was Harry Dobkin. Curiously, Harry had apparently not spotted the fire right next door to his location, and it was a police constable on his beat who alerted the fire brigade, wondering why the local fire watcher had not already done so. Hatton and Keeling re-interviewed the fire brigade, who remembered Harry Dobkin's presence at the scene and insisting he had tried to put the fire out, adding the strange remark, "I didn't do it." Coupled with the fact that they now had a positive identification of the body as Rachel Dobkin and evidence of the abusive marriage, the constabulary had enough to bring Harry in for questioning. When they picked him up at his parents' house at 21 Navarino Road, Dalston, Harry took a piece of paper out of his pocket and, with no prompting, wrote down that he had nothing to do with killing his wife. This struck the detectives as peculiar, as at this point they hadn't even mentioned their reason for asking him to accompany them to the station, nor had they said the word murder. Hatton and Keeling took their suspect to visit the wreckage of the chapel, hoping to elicit a memory or confession. Dobkin denied ever going into the cellar, but a passing local police constable overheard the conversation and said, "I know you. I've seen you go into that cellar before." Harry Dobkin was arrested on Thursday 27th of August 1942 and charged with the murder of his wife 16 months previously. When officers searched his home, they found train tickets which exactly matched the ones found in the victim's handbag in Guildford, suggesting that after killing his wife, he had deliberately bought 2 sets of train tickets, travelled out of London, then planted one of the tickets in her bag to suggest she had left the city. Dobkin was tried at the Central Criminal Court, also known as the Old Bailey, on 17th of November 1942. It too had suffered bomb damage during the Blitz, which had forced the public gallery to close, leaving just a few benches available at the back of the court for spectators behind the large glass wall of the dock. Dobkin pleaded not guilty, and his defence barrister F.H. Lawton criticised the forensic photography methods used to identify the body as Mrs. Dobkin. He tried to raise further doubt by mentioning that the victim's height was 5'1", but Rachel's own sister had said she was 5'3" when she placed the missing persons advert in the newspaper. But Crown Prosecutor Lawrence Burns' soft voice and calm demeanour masked the shrewd astuteness that quashed Lawton's efforts to suggest the deceased was simply an air raid victim. Byrne explained to the court that based on the evidence, Harry Dobkin had strangled his wife on the evening of Good Friday, 11th of April 1941, dismembered her body, then hidden it in the bombed-out chapel. At some point, he had poured lime over the body in the belief it would decompose faster, and when it did not, he had lit a fire in the early hours of Tuesday 15th of April in an attempt to permanently erase his crime. Dobkin maintained his innocence, alleging that police officers had threatened him while writing his statement and urged him to confess. He also claimed that one of the police officers had recited a poem to him called The Wheels of Justice, which ran, "Though the mills of God grind slowly, yet they grind exceeding small. Though with patience he stands waiting, with exactness grinds he all." In response to this literary reminder that justice is always done eventually, whether in this life or the next, Harry apparently quipped, "You make a better hangman than a poet." When Prosecutor Byrne asked him when he had ceased to have any affection for his wife, Dobkin admitted, "On the day I was married." He added, "I always tried to avoid her. I never wanted to see her again after 11th of April." The jury of 7, reduced from the usual 12 due to wartime conditions, were presented with the picture of Rachel's face superimposed on a picture of the skull in the cellar, witness testimony that Harry had been seen with his wife shortly before her death, and the damning catalogue of abuse and mis-support payments. In his summing up, the judge, Justice Wrottesley, advised the court that the identification methods were sound, and the jury could hardly expect the victim's legs to have been cut off if she had been the victim of a bombing raid. He reminded the jury, Dobkin had stood watching the fire burn for about an hour without calling the brigade. You may ask yourselves why a fire watcher, of all people, should have done this. After 20 minutes deliberation, the jury found Harry Dobkin guilty. Before sentence was passed, the defendant rose in the dock and read some remarks aloud from a piece of paper, claiming that the charges had been invented and he had been roughly treated by the police. He displayed no emotion as he was sentenced to death. On the cold, foggy morning of Wednesday 27th of January 1943, Dobkin was hanged at Wandsworth Prison. The post-mortem of the executed man was conducted by Dr. Keith Simpson, who, later in the decade, would examine the body of one of the victims of sadistic sex killer Neville Heath, as well as a victim of acid bath murderer John George Haigh. He became one of Britain's leading forensic pathologists after Bernard Spilsbury, practicing for 40 years. Detective Inspectors Keeling and Hatton retired at the end of the war, just a couple of years after the Dobkin case. Rachel's elderly mother Sarah, tormented by the brutal death, believed that her daughter was trying to communicate with her from beyond the grave, as she often heard unexplained knocking sounds and was woken by her voice at night. Eerily, one of the psychics Polly visited had been close to the truth, having mentioned a hot room and a sudden death, although Madame Nerva had been mistaken when she warned Rachel not to meet someone new, as the threat came, instead, from someone she knew all too well. The inscription on Rachel Dobkin's gravestone reads, "Peace to her dear soul." And it is to be hoped that any other victims will also find peace, as this case leaves us to wonder how many others may lie beneath London's streets and old bombed out buildings, the manner of their violent deaths masked by the effects of war. Thank you for listening to this episode of Prasha's Murder Map. If you enjoy true crime cases from this period in history, you might be interested in my new book, Wartime London's Bonnie and Clyde, The Crime Spree of Betty Jones and Carl Holton, which will be published by Pen and Sword in late 2025. This reckless crime spree, set against the backdrop of wartime London's dark, smoky, bomb-damaged streets, culminated in 22-year-old Carl Holton and 18-year-old Betty Jones shooting dead a private car hire driver named George Edward Heath on 7th of October 1944. Writing the book has been an incredibly challenging yet rewarding project which my wife and I worked on together, visiting archives across England to uncover previously unpublished information about this often forgotten case. We're thrilled to present the first comprehensive, objective account which reveals new information about the two killers, Betty Jones and Carl Holton, their childhoods, and what became of the surviving member of this compelling criminal duo after prison. We reveal for the first time what Betty did after her time in jail, her new name, new husband, and the second chance at life she carved for herself as she sought redemption. We were privileged to trace and communicate with her daughter, who kindly shared memories and information with us to help us better understand Betty's personality. In the process, she too learned things from us that she hadn't known about her mother's life. I'll keep you updated when we have a confirmed release date, but I'll leave a link to my website in the show notes if you'd like to read more about it. For now, thank you so much for your support, and I'll see you again soon for another episode of Prasha's Murder Map.